Hello everyone, it's Infinity Gamer here, and wow, this is a contentious video by my standards. So one of the reasons that I don't like competitive play for some games is that people like to find the grey areas in rules, and then they like to exploit them and go, well, you know, rules is written or it doesn't say that. I hate that play. However, I have found a few examples in Infinity's N4 rulebook, which I have here and it looks beautiful, that maybe lend themselves to a little bit of this grey area play. Now, caveat, I don't do these rules, I don't use them, but I think we should be aware that they are out there and that they might get played by certain players. To make this a little bit fun and not just like here's some grey area rules that you should be smashing from tomorrow onwards, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you the rule, I'm going to show you the page it is in the rule book, I'm going to bring it up on screen as well because we've got that PDF that we can use, and then I'm going to give you my unofficial Infinity Gamer TO ruling, which counts for nothing but is a little bit of fun anyway. And then in the comments, you can tell me whether you think the TO ruling is right, and you can basically then do a rules argument as much as you like. So let's crack into this, let's try and have some fun, and let's get into the first rule. So this first one, I actually saw being used, and I never would have thought of it if I hadn't have seen it myself. So in this example, which you can see, we've got one trooper that's at the corner. Now, we don't need to worry about any other troopers because this is purely a movement rule. So you think it would be pretty straightforward because movement is a very basic part of the game. What this player did was cut the corner of the building in his movement. And the justification for it lies in the N4 movement rules. The second sub-bullet point in the movement short skill says any surface they move on must be at least half as wide as their base. In the examples for the movement rule, it shows moving through a narrow corridor. So this player took that to basically mean that so long as they only cut the corner by half the base width of their model, it was effectively like moving through a narrow corner, and so was perfectly justified. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pause so that you can kind of think of what your ruling would be on this example. And then I'm going to give you my unofficial TO ruling, and then you can go into the comments and see whether it is right or not. So, unofficial TO ruling. I would say this is not a legitimate action. Now the reason for that is that there are some quite explicit examples within the book that show you moving through a gap, and I feel like that's how it's intended. I mean, it says move over catwalks and narrow corridors. It doesn't say to cut the corner of buildings. In other examples it says to use your full movement profile when you're working out the distance that you can go. So I don't think any iteration where you can shorten the effective distance of your model's movement by using these grey areas is allowed. So in this example, if you were to measure effectively to go around this corner, you would be traversing the normal distance that I would say, you know, the expected distance. As soon as you cut the corner of that building, you effectively gain a decent chunk of your movement as a result of that. If I was the TO of a competition, someone was to say, hey look, this guy keeps cutting corners and he says it's legit because of the half base movement rule, I would rule that is not allowed, and that you would need to use your full movement profile to go around the corner. Now, if you disagree with that ruling, jump in the comments and tell me why you disagree with it, and let me know if you think it's good. Have you seen someone try and do this before and never thought to call them out on it? That is my ruling if you care. The next one on the list is Impetuous Movement. Now, this has come under a lot of scrutiny anyway for being a little bit vague and maybe not being explicit as to what's intended, but there's a couple of bits that are maybe hidden within this rule that I think people have missed. So everyone's focused on the fact of what's the intent and what's that, but there's actually a couple of key things that you could really game to your advantage if it doesn't get fixed soon. So the Impetuous rule is in the rulebook, page 101. I've got it up here so that you can read it with me. So there's a couple of things that are ambiguous first, and then there's a couple of things that you can definitely abuse if you want to, and then I'll give you my ruling on those. So clear a couple of common misconceptions around Impetuous is that this is it's not an order necessarily, it's an action that you can take in the Impetuous phase. So how you're supposed to play it is that someone who generates Impetuous order, they get an Impetuous token, not an order, and I keep saying it wrong, so I'm to blame as well for propagating this myth. An Impetuous token goes next to that player, and they can choose to nullify the actions of Impetuous during the Impetuous phase of the turn, or they can choose to affect it and then be bound by the rules of Impetuous. So it's not an order, it doesn't behave the same as orders do. However, if you were to use the Impetuous token and the phase, it triggers everything like an order would. So You spend it like it's an order, but it's not an order. Basically, treat it like it is an order, but it doesn't necessarily have the same rules. So, for example, you can't spend it like a regular order and do all of the same things you can with an order. There are only specific actions, which this rule highlights, that you're allowed to do with that, which I've got a bugbear with one of those, but I won't go into that in too much detail. The tokens removed when they're activated or at the end of the Impetuous phase for any trooper that has not been activated. So you can choose to not activate it, or you can choose to activate it. So if you use an Impetuous activations, you can only use these fixed skills that are listed there, so move and attack and those sorts of things. One thing that's not clear here that I hope gets FAQ'd is whether you can, with jump and climb, whether you can use things like your super jump and climbing plus abilities to then add additional abilities. That's not clear here, and it doesn't seem as though you can do that. Also things like berserk. Not clear that you could necessarily use a berserk action in your Impetuous, which seems odd because if you then go and read the berserk rules, it's basically get into combat, fight all the things, which I think is the intent behind the Impetuous rule, is to basically bloodthirsty get you into combat. So those are some of the outlines. So then when we get when declaring the move jump, you must always use your full corresponding movement value, attempting to perform the first of these options. Now this is where the rule gets vague and open to abuse. Enter silhouette contact with an enemy trooper during this move. Go towards the enemy deployment zone without doubling back from the movement's starting position. One's explicit, which is number 1. Enter silhouette contact with an enemy trooper during this move. Go towards an enemy deployment zone without doubling back. The second one has threads and threads of comments on the forum around why it's poorly worded and why it's ambiguous. Obviously, if you take the wording, you can go towards the enemy deployment zone, but you can choose any point of the enemy deployment zone. So you could choose to be the far left or the far right, and then obviously there's deployment types where there's 2 deployment zones, and it's not clear as to whether you have to head to the closest point or anything like that. So at the moment, the ambiguity is leaving it open to massive abuse. Then there's also the issue of what if you're in the deployment zone? Well, obviously you default to rule 1 because the rule is actually quite clear that you try and fulfill the first objective first and then you try and fulfill the second. But then without doubling back, you kind of don't understand as to whether if the only option you have, like you're in a corner, is to double back. Are you allowed to do that, or are you not able to do the Impetuous? So I think a lot of this could be cleared up by just saying like go to the nearest point of the enemy deployment zone and ignore the doubling back thing. But the first one is actually the one that's open to abuse. Enter silhouette contact with an enemy trooper during this move. Now what it implies is that if you have an enemy trooper that's within your movement distance, so obviously for things like a biker which have an 8-inch move, that could be an enemy, or it's basically if it's in your zone of control, you could head towards it and get into silhouette contact. What it doesn't tell you is what happens if you have 2 enemies that you could get into contact with within that movement. It doesn't specifically say you have to go towards the nearest one, so you could choose the farthest one. And it doesn't say that you have to be able to get into silhouette contact and that's the primary thing. It obviously says that first of these options that the trooper can complete, enter silhouette contact with an enemy trooper during this move. So obviously if you've got 2 or 3 within your zone of control, you could choose any one of those because you're completing that requirement. So you would obviously choose not necessarily the nearest one. If that's been well positioned to be a really good CC unit, you'd choose the weakest one, and you'd actually be able to do that because that is within the written element of this rule. Now what if you don't have any enemies that are within 8 inches of you, or within your movement profile, whether that's 4, whether that's 8, whatever? And I need to specify that because I think there was a lot of confusion that if you had an enemy within your zone of control, you had to head within that. Ignore that, not possible. So the troopers may only move a shorter distance than their first movement if they reach silhouette contact with an enemy or a special terrain area hinders their movement. But obviously you also can't double back on yourself. You don't necessarily have to take the straightest move. So this is the area that's actually open to interpretation. So if you can't meet the first criteria, you can't enter silhouette contact with an enemy trooper during this move. You've got to go towards the enemy deployment zone without doubling back from the movement starting phase. It doesn't specify anything other than not doubling back as the intent behind the move. So could you zigzag towards it? Well, in theory, so long as you're using your full movement, yes. So long as you're not doubling back, yes. You could kind of do an arcing movement that means that technically you don't actually end much closer to the enemies. I mean, it just says you've got to go towards. Go towards is incredibly vague as it is. So do you just have to end a millimeter further towards or closer to the enemy DZ than when you started? Maybe. So this one is hugely open to exploitation and gaming. I don't know what the intent actually was behind Impetuous. Whether they actually just want you to head towards the nearest enemy or head towards the nearest point, or whether they were like actually on an 8-inch move biker that will basically mean it dies, so no one will use it. So not hugely sure around what Impetuous is trying to achieve to know how to fix it. But because it's super vague right now, there's lots of ways in which you can actually game it to your advantage slightly. The biggest one being, if you can't enter silhouette contact, which you won't be able to in your first turn, going towards the enemy deployment zone without doubling back is incredibly vague. You can almost do whatever movement you like, so long as you don't double back on yourself and you go towards the enemy deployment zone. You don't even necessarily have to end nearer. You could argue that. What I'm going to do next is give you my unofficial Infinity Gamer TO ruling on if someone was to try and do some funky movement on this to try and game the rules, and you can tell me whether you agree. I would allow it. I don't like it because I think Impetuous, judging by the blurb that they write before Impetuous, is that they are so pent up with fighting power that they need to get into combat and they're trying to head towards the enemy. But it's been written so vaguely that you can't say that they have to head towards the nearest enemy if there are multiples within their movement profile, or that they even have to take the most direct nearest route towards the enemy DZ. So at the moment, if someone was to try and be funky with their Impetuous, I think it would have to be allowed until an FAQ comes out. Hopefully there is an FAQ about this soon, because I think the intent behind Impetuous needs to be clarified. But obviously jump in the comments and let me know if you think that's the correct interpretation of Impetuous, and if you think that I should change my TO ruling on that. Line of fire. I know what you're thinking. How can you possibly grey area game line of fire? It's one of the most simplistic elements of this game, unlike others where there's maybe multifaceted ways as to how you can get line of fire or avoid it or whatever. In Infinity, we like to think this is quite simple. But there is a way to game it if you really wanted to, although you won't make any friends if you do this. So the line of fire rules are really straightforward. Here they are, pretty much verbatim. So for a trooper to be able to draw line of fire to its target, it must meet these conditions. 1. The target must be totally or partially within the trooper's front 180 arc, unless it has 360 visor, in which case obviously it can see 360, so it doesn't matter. The trooper must be able to see part of the volume of its target with a minimum size of 3x3mm, and line of fire can be drawn from the trooper to any point of the target's volume without being obstructed by any pieces of scenery or troopers, friendly or enemy. So again, seems very, very straightforward. So how can you game this to an advantage? Well, the key lies in the middle bullet point. In this example that I'm showing you here, both troopers are meeting what we would believe to be all of the criteria. They both have their target enemy within their front-facing arc. They can both draw a line of sight to them, but one has line of fire and the other does not. See, the trooper must be able to see part of the volume of its target with a minimum size of 3x3mm. So what I've done here purposefully is made it so that one of these troopers is not exposing a 3x3mm segment of their silhouette. Now, if you were to look at it volumetrically, so vertically and horizontally, to do a 3mm squared, for example, then you would be able to. But because the rules are very specific in that it has to be a 3x3mm area, that's a square, 3mm by 3mm. If you show 3mm vertically, but 2.5 horizontally, you are not meeting the criteria to be able to see that trooper. So if you just make sure that your little 3x3mm patch is not quite 3x3, technically your target can't see you, even though you're clearly exposing enough volume to be shot at. Again, this is definitely one of those where you might not make any friends doing it, but you would definitely be within the rules. So my TO ruling on this is that if you wanted to be a jerk and peek your model out enough so that you could see fully your target, but you were not revealing a 3x3mm square, unfortunately it would be allowed. But you would not have a very long list of people looking to play you ever again. And if that was the only way you were able to win, was by creating these matchups, then I'd say you were not a very good player at all. Unfortunately, as I've said, this would be a yes ruling, but there would be looks of I'm not angry if you do this, I'm just disappointed. There's no need to really go to these levels. So I reckon you just suck it up, take the hit, and don't try and play these sorts of shenanigans. I don't think it's what the rules intended. It's supposed to give you a guide as to the amount that you should be able to see. So you should be able to see a little bit of the volume. I don't think it's there to be intentionally gamed, so don't do it. Do not do it. The last rule on my list is guided. It's a very straightforward one again. In fact, it gets mentioned in the BS attack and is very straightforward. If your model trooper has the attribute BS attack guided skill listed on their unit profile, during the active turn, they may perform a BS attack against a target in the targeted state, which happens when you spotlight a unit, which now pretty much any hacker with a hacking device and hacking device plus can do. So it might be easy to achieve. And without requiring line of fire, they will perform a BS roll with a +6 mod, ignoring all other mods except those imposed by ECM or Timbots to guided attack. So unless the skill itself indicates otherwise, the B will always be 1, regardless of the actual B value of the weapon, blah blah blah. This BS attack always applies the impact template circular trait, even if the weapon used does not have the trait. The distance to the target cannot exceed the weapon's maximum range. The target cannot be in an enclosed room. A possible trajectory for the attack must always exist. BS attack guided has a limit of 5 attacks per turn. For the active player, only weapons that use the BS attribute may be used with the BS attack guided skill. Very straightforward, nothing majorly of note, but kind of spotted that it could be very powerful. I mean, not only does it not require line of fire, which is very handy, especially if you've got a fire team clustered all together, and you don't necessarily have to do it in the turn that the unit that you're targeting became targeted. So you could spotlight something in turn 1 and then wait until turn 3 when they're all bunched up together defending something, and then choose to do a guided attack as long as your trooper with the guided profile is in there. Now, I thought, oh, okay, now this is kind of cool. Maybe, it changes whatever it is to a blast template, so that could be handy if you've usually got like a burst 1 thing. Now then I looked through most of the profiles, and in almost every faction the only thing that has guided is typically a remote bot with a missile launcher, and missile launchers aren't anything majorly special. Obviously it's nice that they would get the blast template, but I think they pretty much get that anyway. And then I spotted something of note. The only profile that seems to maybe be able to make great use of this is, I think this is US Ariadna. They have a tractor, which is not special in most regards, but it has BS attack guided, and there are 3 profiles available. One of them is the deactivator, Tractamol, with absolutely nothing going for it apart from the fact that it's an order at 5 points, and it's got deactivator. Then it's got 2 others. It's got a total reaction with an Uragan multi MRL, and it's got the normal Tractamol with Katyusha MRL. Then I looked at the profiles. Now the Katyusha one is only 9 points, and that's, again, nothing that's majorly special. I mean, it's got a maximum range of 48. The thing with guided is that you ignore all mods applied, but you can only use the maximum one. So in theory, this is able to go up to 48 inches without suffering that -6 that you see from 40 to 48, or the -3 that you see from 16 to 40. You ignore it completely, and you get the +6 mod for using guided. So a tractor mole, which is not exceptional, it's got BS 10, is hitting on 16s up to 48 inches, which is pretty exceptional. Now the ignoring of mods includes things like cover. I'm assuming it includes things like mimetism, because mimetism is worded like it's a mod. So you're pretty much hitting anything on 16s, which is fantastic. Now, obviously, if something has ECM or Timbots, then that's slightly different. But otherwise, yeah, attract them all, hitting on 16s with guided. But then, yeah, so that's pretty good. But then you look at the profile of the weapon. So, Katyusha MRL, nothing massive. I mean, it's double action. It's burst 1 anyway. So, changing it to burst 1 on a template doesn't make any... I mean, it's already got the impact template circular, and it's DA. But typically, you need line of fire. So, to have a double action template is nice. Then you look at the 16-point profile with the Uragan MRL. Anyone who watches this channel regularly knows that I know how to butcher a pronunciation like nothing else. This is similar. So we'd typically be suffering -3 from 16 to 40, and then would be from 40 to 48 -6. Now, obviously, if you're using guided, no issues. Now, Uragan MRL has two profiles, blast mode and hit mode. The hit mode is the one I'm most particularly interested in. Now, I don't know if this is an error on the army builder, because the burst value typically for the blast mode is 3 and the hit mode is also 3. I don't know that they both should be 3, but that is irrelevant for the demo that I have here. Now, the Uragan MRL blast mode is typically circular template anyway, but the hit mode MRL version is not. It's a single target burst. Now, that obviously changes when you're using guided, because it goes to a circular template, and in fact the rules explicitly tell you to ignore all other rules pretty much, apart from use the single template. So if you use the Uragan MRL in hit mode with guided, you are doing a damage 15 weapon, you are using a blast template instead of a single target, and you are using AP and shock on all of the targets, obviously, that circular template is covering. So in my mind, the Tractable at 16 points, 1 SWC, because it's total reaction as well, which I would actually say is excellent. It's also ECM guided -6, so if it is getting targeted by a guided attack, it applies a -6 modifier. It's got shock immunity. I actually think this is a really good model when you actually know how to synchronize it properly. So the rule here is whether something like the Uragan MRL hit mode would be able to be used with guided and use the singular template, still use the damage, still use everything else. My ruling is yes, you would be able to do that. There's nothing to actually say that in a weapon that typically has two profiles that there would be any restriction on you using one profile over another. So yeah, why not use the Uragan MRL hit mode with guided using the circular template, getting damage 15, getting AP and shock on anything that it touches. Now obviously if you're really good and you get that on a fire team, they're not getting they must be getting a dodge, because so the actual target of your shot, so the unit that is spotlighted, would get a dodge, I'm guessing, because they become the target even in a 0 visibility. They might just get like a -3, -6 dodge. Someone jump in the comments and tell me what it actually is. But then anyone who's not the target, so anyone else who is under that template, I don't think would actually get to do anything if they were to be hit. And then it's AP, so it halves the armor value of whatever you're hitting, and it's shock. So if they suffer a single wound, if they're not shock immune, they're dead straight away. So you get a fire team, or you're getting a tag under that, and it can be particularly messy. Now, in all other instances, it's mostly just a standard missile launcher, so nothing hugely to write home about. But with this particular model, definitely one to watch out for, and is definitely one where I would 100% allow it as a TO. And well done on you for taking a 16-point Tractable and using 1 SWC for a total reaction Uragan MRL, just to pair this up with a hacker and do this. Good on you. So that is a wrap for this video. Those are 4 rules that I feel there's slight opportunity for you to game. I think there are probably worse rules in here, and I don't know that, with the exception of many of them, you're actually gaming the system. I just think that you're very clever to have spotted that you can do them and be within the rules. Obviously, this comes with a massive caveat. If there's a grey area and you're using it to gotcha your opponent, don't do that. That isn't a fun gaming experience for anyone, and you might feel happy that you've won by cutting corners or measuring unfairly or using some grey area and go, but rules is written, you can do this. It's not in the spirit of the game. If you're doing it in a tournament setting and that's how you get ahead, it is a hollower victory than if you'd have actually just played to the letter of the law and you had won because you're a better opponent, you're a better player with great skills. That is all I've got for you with this video. Thank you so much for listening, and yeah, let me know if I've missed any particular rules. If I get enough, I might do a follow-up. There are X number of other rules that you could potentially game. Some of them will get an FAQ. I think Impetuous will. I don't think the others really deserve it. They don't need it. They're all fine. Hopefully you're enjoying M4 as much as I am. Grab the rulebook if you fancy it. It is great to leaf through it, but obviously you don't need to because the PDF is online. And feel free to like and subscribe. Follow me on Instagram, follow me on Facebook if you want to see painting updates and everything else. And I will see you in my next video. Thanks, team.